Hello and welcome to another one video. What was the Russian Revolution? On January 22, 1905, a large strike took place under the leadership of the Father Georgy Gapin. They were marching to the Winter Palace to present their petition in front of Tsar Nicholas II. They were attacked by the soldiers of his imperial army, killing thousands of people in the spot. This day is referred to as Bloody Sunday or Red Sunday of 1905. The revolution was proposed in 1905, which demanded control of industries to the workers, land to the tillers, and equal status to the non-Russian nationalities. But this was an absolute failure. This was one of the greatest reasons which caused the successful Russian Revolution in 1917. Actually, the ruler during the Russian Revolution, Tsar Nicholas II, decided to enter into the World War I. It caused great troubles to the people of Russia. The people demanded withdrawal of Russia from the World War in order to restore peace and the other previous demands. This time they followed the principles of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, and this was a great success, and Tsar Nicholas II had to eventually give up and fulfill all the demands of the people. This is what we call Russian Revolution. What is the impact of the Russian Revolution? The Russian Revolution was by no means a specifically Russian phenomenon. It sent shock waves to the Western imperialistic countries, fearing the possibility of revolution in their own lands. Western imperialistic countries viewed communism as a threat and tried to isolate Soviet Union as much as possible. The biggest threat to the imperialistic countries was radical change in the economic structure brought by the revolution. Russian Revolution meant an end to private property, absolute control of state over production, keeping in the view of the needs of the society. The Russian Revolution inspired all over the world the struggles of the colonial people and nations for independence from the Western imperialistic countries. The Indian independence movement was profoundly affected by the Russian Revolution. It gathered momentum and direction from the revolution. In conclusion, this revolution was the most explosive event in the history of 20th century which changed the world forever. What caused the Russian Revolution of 1917? Food shortages in Russian cities and the refusal of the army to fire on demonstrators. Before the First World War, the idea that there would be a revolution in Russia someday was almost taken for granted. The country's form of government was seen as inherently unstable. Absolute monarchy, the Tsar actually used the term autocrat as one of his official titles, meant that violence seemed to be the only way to express dissent against a government. Assassination was commonplace. Nicholas II's own grandfather Tsar Alexander II had been murdered in 1881, two successive Russian interior ministers were murdered, Sapiehin in 1902 and Plehve in 1904, the Tsar's uncle Grand Duke Sergei was assassinated in 1905, and the Russian Prime Minister Stolypin in 1911. Furthermore, in 1905 there had been a revolution, characterized by mass demonstrations, strikes and military mutinies. The Tsar suppressed it by a mixture of repression, about 13,000 executions, 75,000 people imprisoned, and concessions such as the creation of an elected parliament, the Duma. However, in practice the Duma turned out to be a meaningless token. It had no power to appoint or dismiss government ministers, the Tsar alone could do that, and the Tsar could veto any proposed legislation. It did, however, provide hope that things could change in the future. There is a theory that violent revolutions don't happen when people are poor and desperate and without hope. Instead, they happen when things are gradually starting to improve, but too slowly. People can see that change is possible and become frustrated and angry at those holding it back. Russia's social and economic situation was also rife with tension. Serfdom had been abolished in 1861, but the former serfs were obliged by law to pay their former masters for their freedom. These payments were staged over many years and were extremely high, forcing many peasants into long-term debt. The plots of lands allocated to former serfs were tiny, barely able to support a family, while the nobility, the Tsar himself and the church, continued to own over half the land in Russia. Adding insult to injury, it was notorious that the peasants had to intensively cultivate their small farms to wring the last sack of grain from the land, while the nobles and church rarely bothered and often let portions of their vast estates run to waste through neglect. For the struggling peasants, this aroused intense resentment and anger. Many of the poorest peasants gave up trying to make a living as farmers and sold off their land to pay their debts. This created a growing class of landless agricultural laborers, what the Marxists called the rural proletariat. At the same time, a minority of peasants were able to buy up the land being sold by their debt-ridden neighbors at bargain prices and thus became prosperous. This development was encouraged and assisted by the Tsar's government after 1906. His Prime Minister Stolypin hoped that these strong and sober peasant landowners would eventually develop into an English-style class of minor landed gentry, prosperous and firmly supportive of the monarchy. In the villages, though, their newfound wealth at the expense of their poorer neighbors was often resented. The new landowners were nicknamed kulaks, a Russian word that means fists, referring to their supposedly greedy and grasping nature. Before the 20th century, Russia had little in the way of industry. That began to change after the 1905 revolution, and the change accelerated when the First World War began. Huge new factory complexes sprang up around the major cities like Moscow and Petrograd to manufacture the millions of shells, rifles and other munitions needed for the war effort. Tens of thousands of peasants displaced from their farms found employment here, living in dreary barracks-like accommodation and enduring low pay and harsh conditions. Socialist ideas found fertile soil among them. The fact that Russia's industrial working class, although comparatively small in total numbers, was concentrated right around the capital city and the main centers of communication would prove a major factor in the events to come. As such, Russia in 1914 was a powder keg waiting to explode. The nobles and intellectuals were angry at their lack of representation in the Tsar's government. The peasants were angry at their poverty and the vast estates of the nobles apparently going to waste. The workers were angry at their exploitation by the bosses. Some of the Tsar's advisors believed that a victorious war would unite the people behind their emperor in a tide of patriotism and national feeling. It might even have worked, at least for a time, except that the First World War was anything but victorious for Russia. The Tsar's government made two mistakes early in the war which seemed reasonable at the time, but in hindsight were disastrous. First, they conscripted most of the railway workers who maintained and operated Russia's railway network. Only a skeleton staff was left to keep the service running. This was seen as a purely temporary expedient. Nobody expected the war to last more than a few months, and it was seen as vital to mobilize the largest possible number of troops to defeat the enemy. Russia wasn't the only country to take such measures. However, in their case it backfired badly because the general level of education and technical skills training in Russia was significantly lower than in Western European countries, and so it wasn't as easy to train up replacement workers once it became clear that the war would last for years. Furthermore, the Russian military disasters on the front lines meant that the existing railway workers couldn't be released to go back to their civilian jobs, they were too badly needed, or else dead or prisoners. That meant that by 1916, the Russian railway network was starting to grind to a halt, with a 2-year backlog of unfulfilled maintenance requirements. The trains that were still running had to be devoted to military needs, carrying troops and munitions to the front line. So the civilian economy suffered greatly. Inflation soared as full employment in the cities gave people money, but the shops were almost empty of goods to buy, making that money worthless. The second mistake was a more symbolic one. The Tsar's cousin Grand Duke Nicholas had originally commanded the main Russian armies, but in 1915, he suffered a serious defeat as the Germans conquered Russian Poland. On 21 August 1915, therefore, the Tsar demoted his cousin and took personal command of the Russian army. This was intended to boost morale, but it meant that as the Russians suffered further defeats, the Tsar himself would be considered personally responsible for them. He couldn't shrug off the blame onto a subordinate after he made such a public show of taking command. In addition, his focus on military affairs meant that he neglected domestic policy, leaving it mostly in the hands of his wife, who herself was under the malign influence of the religious mystic Rasputin. In the winter of 1916-17, things were going badly. The Brusilov offensive of the previous summer, which had started so hopefully against Austria-Hungary, had ended in stalemate and over 500,000 Russian casualties once Germany got involved. The Tsar was seen as the main obstacle to victory or even a negotiated peace. Furthermore, Russian infrastructure had finally ground to a halt. Food was piling up in the warehouses and barns of the south, with farmers unable to sell it or ship it anywhere useful. In the cities of the north, like Moscow and Petrograd, people were beginning to starve. Petrograd was receiving only 1/6 of the daily grain supply it needed to adequately feed its people. On 7 March 1917, which was 22 February according to the old Julian calendar still in use in Tsarist Russia, workers at the Putilov Company factory outside Petrograd, which made artillery, called a strike to protest against working conditions and government policy. The following day, Thursday 8 March, 23 February Old Style, the women of Petrograd organized a mass demonstration in honor of International Women's Day. They were protesting against food shortages, even bread was expensive and hard to come by. Groups of women marched out to the factories and invited the striking workers to join their protests. Demonstrators filled the streets. Bakeries were attacked by the hungry crowds. On 9 March, 24 February OS, the protests continued. Around 200,000 demonstrators, men and women alike, marched through Petrograd carrying red banners. They no longer merely demanded bread. Now they called for an end to the war and the overthrow of the monarchy. There were reports that some of the demonstrators had started singing the French revolutionary hymn La Marseillaise. Russian words to the song had been composed back in 1875. News of this came to the Tsar in his military headquarters at Mogilev. Alarmed, he telegraphed orders to the commander of the Petrograd garrison, General Kabalov, ordering him to suppress the demonstrations by force. On 10 March, the third day of the street protests, troops confronted the protesters, but the conscript soldiers often refused to obey orders to shoot them. The same happened the next day. And some of the soldiers even took off their uniforms and joined the demonstrations. One notable incident was when the Volinsky Life Guards Regiment, an elite unit that was part of the Tsar's personal guard, disobeyed a direct order to fire on the crowd and instead shot their rifles harmlessly into the air. Even more dramatically, when the Pavlovsky Life Guards were given a similar command, the soldiers instead shot the officer who had given them the order. However, not all the soldiers in Petrograd disobeyed orders. 169 demonstrators were killed on 11 March and over 1,000 injured. These violent events prompted the chairman of the Duma, Rodzianko, to send a panicky telegram to the Tsar warning of disaster. The situation is serious. The capital is in a state of anarchy. The government is paralyzed. Transport service and the supply of food and fuel have become completely disrupted. General discontent is growing. There must be no delay. Any procrastination is tantamount to death. Nicholas dismissed this warning as needlessly alarmist and demanded harsh action by his generals. On Monday 12 March, 27 February OS, the fifth day of the street protests, the soldiers of the Volinsky Life Guards mutinied in protest against their orders the previous day to fire on an unarmed crowd. By the afternoon, several more regiments of the Petrograd garrison had joined them. They took over the state arsenal and began distributing the 40,000 rifles stored there to the waiting crowds of protesters. By nightfall, around 60,000 mutinous soldiers and tens of thousands of armed workers and protesters were in control of Petrograd. Government buildings were attacked and political prisoners released from the jails. Some of those prisoners had, before their arrest, been members of the Menshevik faction of the Russian Socialist Party. In the evening of 12 March they began organizing a revolutionary government for the city. The workers of each factory and the soldiers of each regiment were invited to elect a representative to attend meetings of what became known as the Council of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies. Since the Russian word for council is Soviet 25B, this body is more commonly referred to as the Petrograd Soviet. At the same time, the Duma also attempted to make itself relevant by forming a provisional committee under Rodzianko, which called on the Tsar to share power with them and make Russia a constitutional monarchy. The Tsar, still not taking the situation seriously enough, refused. The following day, 13 March, 28 February OS, the revolution spread outside the capital as the workers of Moscow emulated those of Petrograd and seized control of the city. The Russian Baltic Fleet, based at Kronstadt just outside Petrograd, mutinied and joined the rebels. Most of the soldiers and officers in the capital still loyal to the Tsar went into hiding. The Tsar finally realized that the situation was serious and organized a train to carry him back to Petrograd to take personal command of suppressing the revolt. His train began making its slow, painful way across Russia's creaking and dilapidated railway network. On 14 March, 1 March OS, the Petrograd Soviet issued its infamous General Order No. 1. This called on all the soldiers and sailors of the Russian armed forces to set up their own elected regimental soviets, to control their units in place of the Tsarist officer corps, and to send representatives to the Petrograd Soviet. The order also stated that soldiers should obey the orders of the Tsar or the Duma only when these did not contradict the authority of the Soviet. Meanwhile, the Tsar's train had become stuck in a railway siding near Pskov, many miles from his destination. The train had been diverted there by revolutionary railway workers. On Thursday 15 March, 2 March OS, a delegation from the Duma reached Nicholas in his railway carriage near Pskov. They called on him to abdicate, claiming that the only hope of preserving the monarchy in Russia was for him to take personal responsibility for the crisis and step down in favor of an untainted heir. Nicholas hesitated, asking for time to consider his options, but the delegation insisted and produced signed statements from senior army leaders showing that they had also lost confidence in the Tsar. Faced with this unanimous opposition, Nicholas reluctantly signed a statement of abdication. Nicholas's only son, he also had 4 daughters, Alexei, was a 12-year-old hemophiliac. His condition was incurable, and the slightest cut or bruise was potentially life-threatening. It was not believed that he could survive long, and Nicholas decided that he would not make a suitable Tsar in this moment of crisis. As such, although Nicholas originally intended to make Alexei his heir, he changed his mind and instead declared that his younger brother, the Grand Duke Michael, would be the next Tsar. There was some doubt among lawyers as to whether Nicholas had the power to remove his son from the succession, but such quibbles would soon become irrelevant. Meanwhile in Petrograd, the Provisional Committee of the Duma had come to an uneasy power-sharing agreement with its rival for authority, the Petrograd Soviet. This resulted in the formation of a provisional government, headed by Prince Lvov as minister-president. This body was positioned as a temporary caretaker government, which would organize national elections later in the year under universal suffrage including women, making Russia one of the first countries in the world to allow women to vote in national elections. This election would create a constituent assembly which would be empowered to draw up a new democratic constitution. Nicholas's abdication document was signed at 11:40 p.m. on the night of 15 March. The following morning, the accession of Emperor Michael II was proclaimed to the Russian people. This came as a surprise to Michael himself, who was under house arrest in Petrograd and had no idea what his brother was planning to do. A delegation from the provisional government arrived at Michael's apartment that morning to discuss matters. Michael was reluctant to accept the Tsar's crown. We can assume that he feared it would put him in an impossible position and possibly in danger for his life. However, his public statement was idealistic and principled. He said that he would respect the wishes of the proposed constituent assembly. If the Russian people, through their freely elected representatives, called on him to become their Tsar he would accept, but the decision would be theirs. Until that moment, he declared, the provisional government should hold power. As such, Russia effectively became a monarchy without a monarch. Nicholas was reportedly appalled by his brother's renunciation of the throne, but by now he was also under house arrest and powerless to intervene. 6 months later, on 1 September 1917, Russia was formally proclaimed to be a republic. Grand Duke Michael was unperturbed by this, writing in his diary, "What does it matter which form the government will be, as long as there is order and justice?" Sadly, he would be dead within a year, and Russia would not experience order and justice for a long time to come. The provisional government ruled Russia for the next 8 months, and at first it was widely welcomed as a move towards democracy and openness. However, it was unable to halt the growing crisis. Indeed, matters became even worse under its rule. Its decision to see itself as purely a caretaker government, holding power temporarily until the Constituent Assembly could meet, was noble and idealistic. But also meant that they were reluctant to take any decisive action or make any firm decisions. Matters were allowed to drift, which gave an opportunity to the Bolsheviks who were willing to offer simplistic populist solutions to complex problems. The first problem was that the provisional government insisted on continuing the war against Germany. In July 1917 they even attempted an offensive, named after the Minister of War Alexander Kerensky, over roughly the same ground as the previous year's Brusilov offensive. The Kerensky offensive was a disaster. In just 3 weeks the Russians suffered 40,000 killed, and rather than gaining territory were forced to retreat 150 miles by a German counterattack. Many Russian units mutinied or refused to obey orders. Their officers blamed the revolutionary committees set up on the instructions of the Petrograd Soviet, but in truth, it's more likely that the soldiers simply saw no point in getting killed in a war, which none of them believed in any longer. Over the course of 1917, the Russian army virtually disintegrated. Millions of soldiers just turned their backs on the enemy and went home. The Germans deliberately remained passive, for the most part, in order to avoid provoking the Russians into a great patriotic warlike mood of nationalist reaction to invasion. They were happy to wait for their opponent to collapse on its own. The second issue was land reform. The peasants were angry at the nobles and prelates who held such large estates, while they had to scrape by with so little. A political party known as the Socialist Revolutionaries, SRs, who leaned towards anarchism rather than Marxism, gained widespread support in the countryside by advocating direct action. The abolition of the monarchy, removing the main pillar of the establishment that also supported the aristocracy and the church, triggered the spread of radicalism. Over the course of 1917, people in the villages increasingly took matters into their own hands by forcibly occupying the great estates and dividing them up between the local peasants. The socialist revolutionaries cheered them on. The provisional government wrung its hands and complained that while they agreed that the peasants had a valid complaint and land reform was a worthy cause, they should avoid any illegal actions and wait for the Constituent Assembly. Nobody in the countryside took much notice of them. Finally, the food situation remained critical. The arrival of summer and the relative quietness of the war front allowed famine to be averted for the time being, but there was still too much food in the countryside and too little in the cities. In the face of these problems, Lenin and the Bolsheviks offered a simple slogan: peace, bread and land. Lenin condemned the First World War as a war of conquest so that the Russian capitalists might plunder other nations in alliance with their British and French fellow capitalists. He demanded an immediate end to the war, a peace without annexations or indemnities. Naively, the Bolsheviks believed that Germany would be willing to accept such a deal and everybody could just stop fighting. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would come as a horrible shock to them. As for bread, he blamed war profiteers for the shortages. The capitalists in the cities and the kulaks in the villages, who were accused of hoarding food in order to push up prices and make profits. If he'd been a fascist, he might have leveled similar accusations against Jews. Populists on both right and left often find it helpful to direct the people's anger against a suitable scapegoat. After the Bolsheviks seized power, they instituted so-called war communism in June 1918. Which included the confiscation of all food surpluses beyond the minimum needed to feed themselves from the peasants and the rationing of the food acquired in this way by central distribution centers. While it helped prevent famine, war communism was hugely unpopular and was abandoned in 1921 after the Civil War was over. Regarding land, Lenin's policy was simple. He declared that the land seizures by the peasants should be treated as permanent and legal. This went against orthodox Marxist doctrine, which called for the collectivization of land instead of its division among peasant landowners. Some of his own Bolshevik supporters were outraged, while the social revolutionaries accused Lenin of stealing their policies. Eventually, after Lenin's death, Stalin would reverse this policy and impose collectivization after all, causing widespread death and misery. Nevertheless, in 1917 millions of Russians were attracted to a decisive leader who promised quick solutions to their problems by using simple, easy-to-remember slogans. They rejected the establishment insiders and the tired old political elite of the Duma and turned to Lenin and the Bolsheviks. The actual Bolshevik seizure of power on 7 November 1917, 25 October Old Style, supported by the Petrograd Soviet, was more in the nature of a military coup than a mass revolution. However, the Bolsheviks allowed the election to the Constituent Assembly to take place a couple of weeks later on 25 November, 12 November OS. This was Russia's first and only free nationwide election before 1990. The Bolsheviks won 24% of the votes, with 10 million people voting for them. However, the Socialist Revolutionaries won the election, with 17 million votes and 41% of the electorate. Liberal and conservative parties combined won less than 10% of the votes. Bolshevik support was concentrated in the cities and the armed forces, while the rural districts voted for the SRs. Following the election, the Socialist Revolutionaries split into left and right factions. The left SRs formed a coalition with the Bolsheviks, while the right SRs opposed them. The Constituent Assembly first met in Petrograd at 4 p.m. on 18 January 1918. The session was dominated by right SRs, who strongly criticized Lenin's policies. In response, the Bolsheviks and left SRs walked out of the building. The remaining politicians carried on debating until around 4 a.m. the following morning, then went home. The next day they found troops loyal to the Bolsheviks stationed around the building, who refused to let them in. Lenin announced that the assembly was dissolved after just 12 hours of meeting. At this point it was clear that the Bolsheviks had rejected bourgeois democracy. The left SRs continued to cooperate with them for a while the other socialist parties went into opposition and in many cases into hiding. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on 3 March 1918, outraged many of the remaining SRs who saw it as an abject surrender to monarchist capitalist Germany. Indeed, rumors began spreading that Lenin was a German agent deliberately sent by them to sabotage Russia. On 8 June 1918, several of the SR delegates who had been elected to the Constituent Assembly met in Samara on the river Volga and announced that by virtue of their election, they, not the Bolsheviks, were the legitimate rulers of Russia. This was one of the key events that began the Russian Civil War. But that's another story. What was Russian life like before the Russian Revolution? It's impossible to give just one answer to your questions. Russian society was divided in several classes that were worlds apart and led very different lives. About 90% of the population were peasants, poor and neglected. They were freed from serfdom, which under many masters was basically slavery only a few decades before, and this reform was far from perfect, leaving many peasants with too little land to live off. The vast majority of the peasants was illiterate, couldn't even write their own names. They couldn't afford any professional medical care, and even if they could, there were no doctors in villages. You'd have to travel for up to several days to the nearest city to see one. The peasants lived in simple wooden houses covered with straw, worked from dawn to dusk in the field every day in spring and summer, and in winter their days were busy as well, making clothes, furniture, repairing tools and vehicles, taking care of the cattle. Bad harvests could easily lead to famine because only a few peasants could afford to squirrel some of the harvest away as insurance for bad years. Most Russian peasants only had enough to feed their family and cattle throughout the next year, and maybe a little extra that they sold to buy tools and other things they couldn't make themselves. Peasant boys were regularly drafted to serve in the Russian army. The time of service was 7 years at the end of 19th century, but was shortened to 3 years in 1906, where they were treated little better than animals. Their only entertainments were church services, beautiful nature surrounding their villages, and in autumn when the harvest was over and they had some time to themselves, weddings, dancing, singing and listening to simple self-played music. A few percent of the population were artisans. They led more comfortable lives in cities compared to peasants. Artisans usually lived in apartments above or behind their shops. Some managed to achieve a level of prosperity that allowed them to buy nice clothes, take family photographs, go to theaters and concerts, travel to their relatives in nearby cities and villages, get medical care from professional doctors. Many professional artisans could read and would borrow books in public libraries. Their children went to recently opened free state schools and could even attend universities if the family could afford to support their child for that time. But their sons were also subject to army drafting, and if their business failed, they had little choice but to work for other luckier artisans or in factories. There were also workers. But industry in Russia at the time was just beginning to develop, so the social class was ridiculously small compared to other European countries. Workers in Russia at the time usually came from poor peasant families. They came to cities in hope to earn their living there. Most were illiterate or had only the most basic reading and writing skills. Their working conditions were terrible and inevitably took a toll on their health. They could be fired without any reason and were paid very poorly. And as opposed to the workers in other European countries and in USA, Russian workers for the most part weren't organized in unions, which made it impossible to fight for better working conditions. They lived in small rented rooms and apartments. A whole family usually had only one room at their disposal. But workers could send their children to school, go for walks in city parks, read books from public libraries if they were literate, buy clothes and gamble if they had some money to spare. They could get some basic medical care. Some workers managed to rise through thaw ranks and get white-collar positions that paid much better, and then their lives got much better. Better housing, better food, more entertainment, better clothing, better medical care. Merchants were the fledgling Russian middle class. Some only bought and sold, some owned factories and sold the goods manufactured there. Many merchant families began as artisans or peddlers who became wealthy over the course of several generations and could even rival nobility in their lavish lifestyle. Their children weren't drafted to serve in the army and had access to all levels of education and could pursue different careers if their parents didn't insist on them working in the family business. However, merchants didn't have access to court, which drove many of them to marrying off their daughters to impoverished nobles or bribing courtiers to get themselves some sort of a title of nobility to finally get access to high society. The Russian nobility and royalty only made up under 1% of the population. They enjoyed a comfortable life without poverty. Their children, both boys and girls, could attend schools and universities. They lived in big stone houses in cities and often had one or several country estates. They had servants. They could pursue military career, become scholars, artists, university professors, authors, high-ranking civil servants, and if they didn't want to do any of that, they could just live off their family's capital. They could travel all around the world. They hosted and attended intellectual salons, balls, hunts, collected art, ate good food, and wore beautiful clothes and expensive jewelry. And if a noble family was ever short on funds, they could sell some of their land or get a daughter-in-law from a wealthy merchant family, many of which saw making such a family connection with nobility as an ultimate status symbol amongst their peers. As you can see, life in the Russian Empire before the October Revolution was very different depending of which family you were born into. And these differences largely determined people's opinions on the revolution. Lower classes who saw their lives improved thanks to getting access to education medicine, entertainment were much more likely to embrace the revolution that merchants and nobility who had their privileges suddenly stripped. Was the Russian Revolution inevitable? The Russian Revolution was inevitable because it was an outside job. Lenin was a representative of the different Western capitalist powers, Kaiser Wilhelm, Brits, USA, to destroy Russian Empire and dismember Russia. Russian Empire was for 90% agrarian state. Russians peasants worshipped Russian royal family. Peasantry had a good life in Russian Empire. They didn't support Lenin and they didn't want any revolution. Who supported Lenin? Let's start with German Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilhelm financed the Russian Revolution for the sake of to put the Emperor Nicholas down and pull the Russian Empire out of the WW1. The German Imperial Treasury approved 2 million marks to support revolution in Russia in 1910. Bolsheviks were getting not only propaganda support, weapons and dynamite also crossed the border. With the help of these presents from Germany, ships were sunk in Archangelsk and ports were set alight. Lenin's actions were coordinated by the German ambassador in Copenhagen, Count Ulrich von Brockter-Franzau. Kaiser Wilhelm II had spent around €500 million, $582 million, in today's money to successfully destroy Russian Empire. Wilhelm and Nicholas were cousins too. Britain supported Lenin. Lenin was very successful in all what he did. That's why Brits defend and protect him. Lenin worked for British interests, and he was always in good contact with them. Brits played a double game to see who wins. Officially they obviously supported monarchist White Army, but secretly they aligned with Lenin as well. Brits hated Emperor Nicholas. They proved it when they denied him asylum in UK. Brits wanted Nicholas dead. They ordered Lenin to kill Nicholas' family. If Britain would not annulated Brest-Litovsk Agreement, then communist Lenin would be executed as a traitor by Red Army and his fellow Bolsheviks would lose the power. Didn't capitalist Britain dream about it? Nope. Russian Bolsheviks were good friends of Britain. They helped to destroy Russian Empire. Why Brits annulated Brest-Litovsk Agreement? Did they had a legal rights to annulate somebody else's agreements since they didn't sign them? In 1915 Lenin actually made a promise to the German HQ to bring a revolutionary Russian army to India and strike the British in the back, and this promise was made at a time when he was in exile and had no power, no money at all. Look at a map and figure out the thousands of kilometers they would have had to march across deserts and high mountains. Russia had no useful navy able to ship an army to India. It was a throwaway gift, of course, and Lenin had no intention of delivering on it. He counted on that by the time the stakes were up, the Kaiser would be gone. And so he was. By annulating Brest-Litovsk Agreement, Brits supported Lenin and his Bolsheviks. In fact, Lenin knew that Brits will annulate the agreement long before he signed it. It's the widely known fact. How Lenin knew in 1915 what will happen with Kaiser in 1918. Britain didn't afraid communists. Brits supported Lenin. Brits played a double game. How political double game works, for example. Soros openly generously finances USA Democratic Party. But secretly he finances a little bit of Republican Party. Why? To neutralize the enemy you need good friends in the enemy camp. You never know who win. Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of Tsar Nicholas II, blamed the British monarch George for the executions of the Russian royal family, for the support of February Revolution, and for support of Bolsheviks. In 1920, Pavlovich wrote of his hatred for George V, whose betrayal would not be forgiven by Russians far into the future. Dmitry wrote afterwards, who had sent a congratulatory telegram to Kerensky. The Russian Revolution leader was set up by British, who had pretended that the February Russian Revolution would lead to victory. Who did not lift a finger to save Nicky and his family. He is a scoundrel. This wretch George will not be forgiven by Russians even far into the future. Russian Duke branded George V scoundrel over massacre of Tsar after the revolution. Russian refugees spread throughout Western Europe, many choosing to settle in Paris or Berlin. London was the least hospitable place to go because the British government were reluctant to accept Russian migrants onto British shores during a time when the British working class were praising the Russian Revolution and Marxism. But in the case of Lenin, he was an official representative of the Western interests. All this project, nicknamed Russian Revolution, was an outside job to destroy and to dismember the Russian Empire and to use a newborn Eastern European countries as new British or American colonies within Europe. Brits simply wanted peace of Russia. It was a British idea to grant the independence to Poles, Czechs, etc. They used Lenin and Versailles Treaty to implement this project. Britain was losing their old colonies, so they decided to organize new colonies within Europe. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, share, subscribe the video.